Binuwag ni Pangulong Bongbong Marcos ang Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission o PACC. Komisyong binuo ni Pangulong Duterte sa ilalim ng kanyang opisina noong 2017. Ikinalungkot ni dating PACC Chairman Greco Bellica ang pagbuwag sa kanyang komisyon.
Ang korupsyon po kasi talamak na problema pa rin ng bansa eh.
The Marcos administration remains a hot topic of discussion, standing as one of the most debated presidencies in the nation's history. The rise to power of the son of the late dictator, Ferdinand Marcos, has especially fueled conversations, particularly because one of his campaign pillars was an anti-corruption war. It's a topic that certainly raises eyebrows. It's worth mentioning that numerous commentators have pointed out the contrast between father and son. Ferdinand Marcos Sr., the father of Marcos Jr., governed the Philippines under martial law, a period heavily criticized for rampant corruption. This stands in stark contrast to his son's current mission, which is ostensibly aimed at combating corruption. The difference is striking to say the least. To understand further, let's begin with the basics. What has Marcos promised? In a nutshell, he's vowed to rid the government of endemic corruption. One of his most bold moves was the announcement to abolish the Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission and the office of the Cabinet Secretary. Now, you may be asking, why would someone who wants to fight corruption abolish an anti-corruption commission? Well, Marcos argues that these organizations have essentially become redundant, even counterproductive. He believes that they've served more as political tools than effective arms of fighting corruption. So in his view, getting rid of these bodies will make the government more efficient. It sounds like a reasonable argument, but critics aren't so easily convinced. They're skeptical about the real motivation behind such a radical move, with some speculating that it could be a tactic to centralize power. Then comes his decision to strengthen the Presidential Commission on Good Government, an agency originally formed to recover the Marcos family's alleged ill-gotten wealth. Irony aside, the question remains, can this agency under his leadership effectively combat corruption? He plans to revamp its role, turning it into a more robust institution. Again, a laudable idea on paper, but it brings us to another question. What will this empowerment look like in practice? Are we talking about increasing funding, more autonomy, or perhaps more substantial investigative powers? In an environment where corruption is endemic and systemic, it is crucial to scrutinize the steps being taken to tackle it. For instance, Marcos is calling for an overhaul of notoriously corrupt departments like the Bureau of Internal Revenue and Customs. But how does he plan to do this? Will it involve stringent vetting of officials, or perhaps technological interventions to reduce human discretion and therefore the scope of corruption? And finally, let's touch upon another important point: Marcos's surprising call to forget the past. This statement could be seen as an effort to pave the way for a unified front against corruption. But given the Philippines' history and the legacy of his own family, is such selective amnesia warranted or even ethical? After all, forgetting the past can often mean being doomed to repeat it. Now, we've talked about the lofty promises and ambitious steps that Marcos has put forth in his war against corruption. But what about those who aren't buying it? Let's delve deeper into what the critics and opposition parties are saying. Trust me, they've got a lot to say, and it's only fair to hear them out. First, there's the concern about the Marcos family legacy. Now, I know the man himself has urged everyone to, quote, forget the past, but his critics argue that the past is precisely where you'll find the context for today's promises. They point out the allegations of corruption that were leveled against the Marcos regime, overseen by his father, Ferdinand Marcos. The obvious question that critics pose is, can a family with such a tainted legacy genuinely commit to anti-corruption? In addition, some political observers and opposition figures say that his plans, such as abolishing the Presidential Anti-Corruption Commission, are too drastic. They worry that this could create a power vacuum and possibly centralize authority in a way that might be dangerous for democratic checks and balances. The idea here is that by removing existing structures, you might end up doing more harm than good. These critics question the wisdom of dismantling systems without first ensuring that there are more effective mechanisms to replace them. There are also questions about the lack of transparency in his approach. Critics point out that while Marcos has been very vocal about what he wants to abolish and revamp, there's been less discussions on how this will be implemented. Plans are great, but in politics, it's the execution that counts. Critics are calling for a detailed roadmap that outlines exactly how these anti-corruption measures will be rolled out. Another point of concern is the risk of selective justice. Skeptics worry that this anti-corruption drive may be used as a smokescreen to settle political scores. We've seen this play out in other countries, where anti-corruption campaigns have conveniently targeted opposition figures while sparing allies. Let's also not forget about the media's role in all of this. Some media outlets and investigative journalists who have scrutinized Marcos's promises have faced a barrage of online harassment. This raises questions about the environment in which this anti-corruption campaign is taking place. Is there room for genuine open debate, or is dissent being stifled? Finally, for many critics, the lack of focus on judicial reform is a glaring omission. If the judiciary isn't strengthened and made more transparent, can any anti-corruption drive truly be successful? They argue that without judicial integrity, even the best-laid plans might just end up as another chapter in a long history of failed attempts to rid the country of corruption. All right, so we've delved into Marcos's plans, his supporters, and his critics. But how does all of this look from the outside? What is the international view on Marcos's war against corruption? Hold tight, because the global stage has its own set of lenses through which it sees the issue. Firstly, there's the diplomatic angle. Several countries are keenly interested in how corruption is tackled in the Philippines because it impacts foreign investment, among other things. Countries like the United States, China, and neighboring Asian members are all watching closely. Marcos's policies might very well influence the Philippines' diplomatic relations, especially if he decides to root out corruption in sectors that involve foreign investments or international aid. Secondly, international watchdogs and NGOs specializing in corruption and governance are also weighing in. Organizations like Transparency International often release corruption perception indexes, and how the Philippines fares under Marcos's leadership will be an interesting aspect to track. Some of these organizations have already expressed cautious optimism, but they insist on seeing concrete steps and reliable data before giving any endorsement. The media outside the Philippines also has its take. While many global news platforms acknowledge the audacity of Marcos's anti-corruption plans, they also express reservations, much like domestic critics. They cite historical context, often bringing up the family legacy as a point of concern. The international press also focuses on the potential for authoritarian rule, especially if anti-corruption bodies are abolished and power gets centralized. Finally, how can we forget the impact on overseas Filipino workers? These individuals are considered national heroes, and their remittances are a significant contributor to the Philippine economy. Any move that even remotely hints at corruption within agencies handling overseas employment is going to attract international scrutiny, not just from governments, but also from human rights organizations. Here's where it gets really interesting. The contradictions. While Marcos talks about abolishing agencies to reduce bureaucracy, some people can't help but see it as an attempt to concentrate power. After all, the devil is in the details. And there's also the issue of accountability. If you're going to take a stand against corruption, you've got to be transparent and accountable, right? However, questions surrounding his own family's ill-gotten wealth have not been fully addressed, casting a shadow over the campaign. Now, what could go wrong? It's easy to get wrapped up in the positive rhetoric, but we have to be prepared for any pitfalls or unintended outcomes of Marcos's war on corruption. First, the risk of concentrating too much power in the hands of a few. If Marcos goes ahead with his plans to abolish certain anti-corruption bodies, we could see a power vacuum that might not be filled in the most democratic way. This concentration of power could lead to a new form of corruption, just dressed up differently. So instead of solving the problem, there's a risk of just reshuffling it. Secondly, there's the issue of public trust. In a country that has seen a multitude of corruption scandals, people are naturally skeptical. Even if Marcos has the best intentions, and even if he starts showing results, there's the monumental task of convincing the public that this isn't just another political gimmick. The risk here is that even a few missteps could result in widespread disillusionment, which could halt the momentum of anti-corruption initiatives.
Many months later.